Hi, London.
Ooh,
Carol, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, wonderful. It's working out very well.
Good,
So I
good.
think we could start.
You ready to start?
We are
Okay, well, we're
ready to
ready.
start. All people
Uh,
are in front of their screens. And okay, hello.
hello. Well, hello. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Carol Siegel. I'm director of the Freud Museum in London, and I'd like to welcome you to the Freud Museum London and to the annual Sigmund Freud Lecture of the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all virtually into Sigmund Freud's final home in London, the house where he settled, where he and his family settled after fleeing Nazi-occupied Vienna in 1938. On the anniversary of Sigmund Freud's death, I'm standing in the study where Freud lived and worked for the last year of his life. And you can see around me, I think, you can see the famous original psychoanalytic couch where Freud saw his patients. And on my other side, which may be less familiar to you, is the couch on which Freud actually spent his final weeks and indeed took his final breaths. And we've had that in the study for some time for visitors to see. I hope that those of you who are not familiar with Freud's home in London will be able to visit us one day before too long. I know that this is a very special day for my colleagues in Vienna, and on behalf of all of us at the museum in London, I'm sending you hearty, warm congratulations on the reopening of your splendid new museum. And I can't wait to visit in person and see the transformation that has taken place. Today also feels very special as part of the relationship between our two museums, one in London, one in Vienna. In the time that Monica Pessler and I have been directors of these two institutions, we have talked often of how the two houses are, as we have put it, two sides of the same coin. Our joint project is telling the story of Sigmund Freud and his legacy. And it's very much a shared project and one that we've enjoyed working on together. And this makes it a particular pleasure that tonight's lecture comes from both our houses. And we're so pleased that we have been able to participate in this way. And after this brief introduction, I'm now going to hand over to Monica Pessler in Vienna, who will be introducing tonight's lecture and tonight's speaker, Dr. Jacqueline Rose. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, very much for your nice words and greetings. And yes, this exchange via live stream today between our two Freud museums is somehow and once again something like a fulfillment of our two dreams. To be able to present and to point out that Berggasse 19 and Maresfield Gardens are, as you mentioned before, the two sides of one coin. Because the development of psychoanalysis did not stop with Freud's expulsion from Vienna in 1938, it continued to our days. And I'm very grateful that you host our today's Freud lecturer and that you made this virtual connection possible. We are more than happy that Jacqueline Rose agreed to be the Freud lecturer 2020, and I'm especially glad that she reacted very spontaneously, choosing her topic for today. Her Freud lecture today, exactly 81 years after Freud passed away, is titled To Die One's Own Death, Thinking with Freud in a Time of Pandemic. And it will be about a question that affects all of us in these days. What can we learn from Freud? Thought about how to live and how to die in our own troubled times. Jacqueline Rose is a renowned feminist, a literary and cultural critique, professor of humanities and co-director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities, at the University of London, UCL. She is a fellow of the British Academy too, a regular writer for the London Review of Books and The Guardian, and the co-founder of Independent Jewish Voices, founded in 2007, a network of Jews in Britain who share a commitment to certain principles, among others, but first of all, putting human rights first and rejecting all forms of racism. Her research focuses on modern subjectivity at the interface of literature, psychoanalysis, and politics. One of her works, Sexuality in the Field of Vision, has been translated into German, Sexualität im Feld der Anschauung, published by Turia Kant in 1996. In her book, Mothers, an essay on love and cruelty from 2018, she focuses on the current political and social state of motherhood in our continental culture. And there is more than one mother who told me that this book was so important and incredibly helpful to handle and understand their own motherhood. On Violence and on Violence Against Women will be published early next year. Jacqueline, you gave your first Freud lecture face-to-face to the Viennese audience in 2000. This time, and given to the challenges of our days, you will share your thoughts with us via live stream. After the lecture, the psychoanalyst and chairwoman of our advisory board, Jean-Wolf Bernstein, will moderate the following discussion, assisted by Daniela Finzi. Dear Jacqueline, here you are. Thank you so much for being here and with us today, and to all those who are in front of their screens joining the Sigmund Freud Lecture 2020, also our warmest welcome. Thank you very much.
I truly don't know how to begin. It is, as I'm sure you can imagine, completely overwhelming to find myself in this space at this time when everybody is going through such pain and difficulty and being pushed to the limits of what they can know, understand, and bear to live with and die with. I'm deeply honored to have been asked to give this lecture, although none of us realized when I accepted what was about to unfold. Let me begin with some thanks to Monica Pessler, Daniela Finzi, Nora Haas, and Natasha Halbar from the Freud Museum in Vienna, all of whom have made it possible for me to participate today. And I'm really very appreciative. And I also want to thank the invisible work that will have been being done behind the scenes, both in Vienna and in London. My thanks also to Carol Siegel and the people who've made it possible for this to happen here today, and to John Wolf Bernstein. It's a great privilege to have you chair this event or moderate the discussion. I don't think I ever thought the day would come where I would be standing in this space talking to you. I want to welcome you, both the people in Vienna and the virtual audience, and I want to welcome friends, and I was going to say strangers, except of course one of the questions thrown up by the present crisis is whether anybody is anymore a stranger, and if so, in what way. So to start the lecture, and thank you all for being here, I start with an epigraph from Rachel Burdach, her 1938 novel, The Emperor, the Sages and Death, which was one of the last books that Freud read and was deeply moved by. I want to know why we, like upside-down sunflowers, turn to the dark side rather than to the light. I'll come back to this book at the end of the lecture. What is left of the inner life when the world turns more cruel or appears to turn more cruel than ever before? Reeling from inflicted blows, Pandemic, war, starvation, climate devastation, or all of these together, what happens to the torn fabric of the mind? Is its only option defensive, to batten down the hatches, haul up the drawbridge, to use the common figures of speech for a subject under assault, or more simply and with single-minded purpose, to survive? And does that leave room to grieve, not just for loved ones who have been lost, but for the shards, the broken pieces and muddled fragments of the human heart, which at the deepest level make us all who we are? Barely 6 months after the outbreak of World War I, on Christmas Day 1914, Freud wrote to Ernest Jones lamenting that the psychoanalytic movement is, quotes, now perishing in the strife of nations. The two men were separated by being on opposite sides in the war. I do not delude myself, he continued. The springtime of our science has abruptly broken off. All we can do is to keep the fire flickering in a few hearths until a more favorable wind makes it possible to light it again to full blaze. At a time of pandemic like the one we are living today, is there room in the world for anything even vaguely akin to the complex reckoning with life and death that is the unique domain of psychoanalysis? As our screens flicker daily with the toll of the dead, it is hard not to be overcome by the scale of the tragedy, which has left loved ones dying in isolation, funerals pared back beyond decency, the rituals of family caring and commemoration which make death manageable, or almost manageable, outlawed and spent. Not to speak of the interminable counting, the endless numbers by rote that reduces humans to abstractions, robbing us a second time of each individual loss. When the statistics threaten to throw me off balance, writes UK palliative care Dr. Rachel Clark of her struggle to restore dignity to those dying in hospital, I try to keep things as small as I can. Even harder perhaps in such moments is the idea of allowing ourselves to be in touch with the emotional ambivalence towards the dead as much as towards the living, which in our non-pandemic existence, if such a world can ever be imagined again, is our daily psychic fare. Truth, according to the famous saying, is the first casualty of war, but psychic truth is not what is being talked about. War and pandemic strip the mind bare. They share a brute ability to smother our psychic repertoire. Just for a second, if only in the public mind, they make grief seem pure. We cheer soldiers off to battle and weep when they fall. We stand by gut-wrenched and helpless, eyes raised to an empty sky, as the pandemic ravages its way through the homes and havens that had allowed us to cherish the illusion of a safe world. You have, my poor child, seen death break into the family for the first time or heard about it. Freud writes to his eldest daughter Mathilde when Heinrich Graf, husband of Rosa, his sister, her aunt, died suddenly in 1908. And, he continues, you have perhaps shuddered at the idea that for none of us can life be made any safer. He was offering no false consolation. We do not live in a safe world. Although he did insist that for old people like himself, an awareness of the inevitable end is what gives life its special value. He was, by the way, on the eve of his 52nd birthday, one of the several dates during his life when he was convinced that he would die. On January the 25th, 1920, Freud's favorite daughter, Sophie Halberstadt Freud, he called her his Sunday child, died during her third pregnancy of complications arising from the final wave of the Spanish flu. The disease had ravaged Europe for 2 years from its first recorded case on March the 4th, 1918, to the last case sometime in March 220, wiping out millions in its wake. His daughter was therefore one of its late casualties, falling like a soldier who is killed just before or after peace is declared, a bitter irony, given that the final wave to which she succumbed was by no means the most deadly of the three. Beyond the fact of their historical coincidence, the plague and the war were two piled up disasters. The destiny of one fueled and or was driven by the fate of the other. Erich Ludendorff, the general in command of the German forces, declared that the Spanish flu had robbed him of victory. Things had started to go downhill for the Central Powers from April 2018, when the disease made its first appearance in the trenches. Right up to March of that year, the Allies had been confident that they had been winning the war. the Axis powers, I should have said. Strange as it might seem, the Spanish flu has turned out to be a silent stalker of history, barely included in the lists of the world's modern afflictions, although its deaths pretty much exceeded the combined toll of the 2 world wars. According to chronicler Laura Spinney in her book on the subject, which she wrote before COVID-19, people hardly ever talked about it. An event that can fairly be described as the worst massacre of the 20th century has been rubbed out of history. Freud himself barely mentions it, although it claimed 15,000 Viennese. By autumn 1918, schools and theatres in the city were being intermittently closed to reduce the risk of infection. In 1919, the year before Sophie's death, 3 of his other children, Anna, Ernst and Mathilde, had all fallen ill. In May of the same year, his wife Martha, after years of undernourishment due to the war and of trying to manage for the whole family, went down with a case of grippe, pneumonia flu, which is exactly the diagnosis Freud will use for Sophie's illness, with recurrent waves of high fever, from which she took 2 months to recover. And conditions were, of course, not alleviated by the end of the war. In fact, by then, a defeated Austria was left, in the words of Stefan Zweig, a mutilated rump bleeding from all arteries. By then, Freud, far from his earlier exhilarated support for the Central Powers, welcomed the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I weep not a single tear, he said, for this Austria or this Germany. On the other hand, he pronounced in 1914, in response to the declaration of war, all my libido is given to Austria-Hungary. We are all of us slowly failing, he wrote in 1919 to the Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi, one of his most important interlocutors. We are failing in health and bulk. The family was subsisting on a starvation diet, Hungerkost. A year later, Freud and his wife were unable to get to their sick daughter because there were no trains. Not even a children's train, he wrote in January the 27th, 1920, to the Swiss pastor, Oskar Pfister. He was referring to the trains of the International Children's Association that were ferrying children out of starving Austria. In fact, over the preceding years, Freud's greatest anxiety had been for his 2 sons, Martin and Ernst, who had eagerly enlisted at the outset of the war. A third brother, Oliver, rejected for active service, served the army as an engineer. It was the dangers they faced as soldiers at the front which troubled his dreams. A Nightmare in 1915 had as its manifest content, he said, very clearly, the death of my sons, Martin first of all. He termed it a prophetic dream. His sons would outlive their father's nighttime prophecy, but he was right to tremble on their behalf. A prisoner of war on the Italian front, Martin eventually returned home in April 1919, but he was one of the very lucky ones. More than 800,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers had died either in battle or from disease. Clearly, at no point did Freud have the slightest intimation, and why indeed would he, that it was the fate of his daughter at the mercy of the Spanish flu which he should most dread. Now, as I was preparing for this lecture, it slowly became clear that because of COVID-19, I would not be able to deliver it on May the 6th, the anniversary of Freud's birth, as has been the unfailing tradition for these lectures, I believe, up to now. Instead, the decision was made to postpone the lecture to another no less significant date today, September the 23rd, 1939, the anniversary of the day that he died. The switch seems apposite and poignant, resonant of the times, whilst also echoing the tension between affirmation and destruction, between life and death, which were increasingly from this moment at the core of Freud's work. It was no doubt in response to this pressing context that I found myself newly alert to the wretchedness of the hour as it closed around Freud's family in Vienna, closed indeed around the very walls in which some of you are meeting and in which you had your major celebration of the reopening of the museum today, first during World War I and its aftermath, and then on the cusp of the even more deadly Second World War. I became acutely aware, that is, of how the disasters of history penetrate and are repudiated by the mind, including my own, since during a lifetime of preoccupation with Freud, I do not feel I had grasped the full scope of this reality before. Psychoanalysis begins with a mind in flight that cannot take the measure of its own pain. It begins, that is, with the recognition that the world, or what Freud sometimes calls civilization, makes demands on human subjects which are too much to bear. Rereading the famous biographies, Ernest Jones, Peter Gay, Max Schur, I was struck this time by just how exposed and vulnerable Freud was to the ills, major and petty, of the times, and of the fierce contrast in his moods between blindness and insight, equanimity and dismay. Freud was articulate about what he found personally most insufferable. Debt was his greatest fear. To those afflicted by poverty, he responded with a mix of compassion and dread. By the end of the war, he had lost 19/20ths of his own cash savings, i.e. nearly all of it. Rationing during and after the war he hated. There were no lengths he would not go to in order to secure the precious cigars that were killing him. For all the privilege of this Viennese family, although it is too easily forgotten just how long it took him to find his financial feet, they skirted penury and floundered in well-being and health. As we have seen only too clearly in the course of this past year, disaster uncovers the material and racial fault lines of its society, but it also unforgivingly exposes the truth that no human subject is spared the fragility of life, or in Freud's words, the perplexity and helplessness of the human race. To read Freud against this backdrop is to witness a spirit capable of the wildest fluctuations, covering in spirit and person the entire range of switching moods to which everyone I know affected by today's pandemic has at one point or another succumbed. We are suffering under no restrictions, no epidemic, and are in good spirits, he wrote to Ernest Jones at the outset of the war, when his misplaced faith in the cause of the Central Powers had not yet begun to wane. Curiously, he wrote to Ferenczi in February 1917, when food was scarce and lack of heating froze his fingers, making anything apart from letter writing impossible, my spirits are unshaken. Proof, he continued, of how little justification in reality one needs for inner well-being. In August 19, he wrote to Karl Abraham that he felt he could once again venture to join in or endure the world's pleasure and the world's pain. Freud would also plunge into mental darkness. One has to use every means possible to withdraw from the frightful tension in the world outside, he wrote to Ferenczi in 1916. It is not to be borne. In November 1914, when the full horror of the war was just beginning to emerge, he wrote to Lou Andreas Salome, whose picture is here on the table beside me, I and my contemporaries will never again see a joyous world. It is too hideous. Mankind was a doomed experiment and did not deserve to survive. Quote, we have to abdicate, he continued the same letter, and the great unknown, he or it lurking behind fate, will one day repeat such an experiment with another race. In an astounding gesture of radical self-abnegation, not the type of gesture for which he is best known, Freud was willing to sacrifice humanity, as we might say in current parlance, to save the planet. Later in the 1930s, when the next war was starting to appear on the horizon, Freud speculates again that approaching the end, the human race is approaching the end as, quote, the perfection of the instruments of destruction will allow two enemies to exterminate each other. Our great failing, he suggests, is the gulf which, quote, earlier periods of human arrogance had torn too wide apart between mankind and the animals. Freud's despair was global and multi-species in its reach, although as far as I am aware, this has received virtually no commentary. The idea that his concerns were restricted to the small privileged elite of Vienna is, as some of us have argued for a long time, a travesty. It was, however, the tragedy closer to home, the 1920 death of Sophie, that ushered his despair into a new phase. Although it would not be until the death of his beloved grandson, Heinele, Sophie's firstborn, who died 3 years after her own death at the age of 4 of tuberculosis, that he would declare that all his joy in the world had gone forever. I myself was aware, he wrote to Hungarian friends Kata and Lajos Levi, of never having loved a human being certainly never a child, so much. Years later, he would write on the meaning of such a loss to Ludwig Binswanger after the death of his friend's son. We shall remain inconsolable and never find a substitute. It is the only way of perpetuating the love which we do not wish to renounce. An idea which, as John Wolf Bernstein has pointed out, could not be further from his best-known writing on mourning as a task that's meant to be completed. So what, we can now ask, on this 100-year anniversary of the death of Sophie Halberstadt Freud, did the loss of the beloved daughter do to her father, Sigmund Freud? And how might this story help us confront the awfulness of our time, when unimaginable deaths, Freud described the war as inconceivable, are legion as they spread across the world's horizon once more? In his 1923 study, Fritz Wittels, Freud's first biographer, suggested that there was a link between Sophie Halberstadt's death and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the work of 1920, which, as you know, many of you will know, Freud introduces the idea of the death drive for the first time. Freud's rebuttal came fast. The suggestion was implausible. The first draft was written in 1919 when she was still alive. It turned out that Freud had preempted Wittels, writing to Max Eitingen in July 220, that's 3 years before Wittels' biography appeared. You will be able to certify, he stated, as if he were already heading off Wittels' claim before he made it, that it was half finished when Sophie was alive and flourishing. Now this is already bizarre. Half finished means plenty room for additions after her death. And why, we might also ask, would the fact that it was completed before she died be presented as something which in an unspecified future would be in need of being certified? Today, thanks to the efforts of the inimitable Freud scholar Ilse Grubik-Simitis, who first brought to light the early manuscripts of Freud's writing, we know that Freud was being evasive. An entire new chapter, chapter 6, which makes up the book's longest section by far, was added to a subsequent draft, taking up almost a third of the published text. And the additional chapter contained the first appearance in print of the term death drive. Its only prior appearance was in 2 letters to Eitingen of February 1920, barely weeks after Sophie's death. I think it would therefore be fair to say that Freud owes the genesis of this unprecedented concept to her. In his response to Wittels, Freud dismissively acknowledges as the only addition, quote, the discussion concerning the mortality or immortality of protozoa. Freud is surely displaying here what he himself so brilliantly described as the kettle logic of the unconscious, in which a defendant offers a run of arguments, each one invalidating the next. He had finished the text already. There is nothing significant in the additions that he made. The only new material concerned the immortality and or mortality of biological life, as if such a topic could have no bearing whatsoever on the death of a child. In his letter to Pfister after she died, he described Sophie as being snatched away, as if she had never been. The undisguised brutality of our time, he continued, weighs heavily upon us. Nothing surely conveys the sense of a life being snuffed out forever than loved ones in the prime of their lives dying in the midst of a war or pandemic, in this moment of Freud's life, both more or less at the same time. How on earth do you hold on to any intimation of futurity beyond death, whether in the shape of the immortal germplasm or the eternal soul, when people all around are dying like flies? Now, Beyond the Pleasure Principle is, of course, one of the most important works of the second half of Freud's life. It is the culmination of his new thinking on the topography of the mind and introduces the new dualism of the drives. It has excited passionate enthusiasm and virulent hostility in equal measure. Max Shaw goes to considerable lengths to discredit it, which might seem odd given that his book is devoted to understanding the place of death in Freud's life and work. But the idea of an unconscious demonic principle driving the psyche to distraction could be said to sabotage once and for all the vision of man in control of his mind, and is therefore for sure, as it will be for many others, an anathema. I am not exaggerating. Shaw, as we all know, was Freud's physician in his dying years. on the basis of the profoundest understanding and a spoken agreement between them, and when the pain of his patient's cancer left life without value or meaning, Shaw administered the fatal dose of morphine that killed Freud. I have to say I was not anticipating that this couch would be beside me as I spoke. It was unquestionably Freud's wish. Shaw is eloquent on the dignity with which, after suffering from cancer of the jaw for 16 years, Freud approached the end of his life. But at the risk of wild analysis, my reading is that Shaw could only live with what he had done, so long as he could trust in man's ability to subordinate his will to his reason, and, contrary we might say, to the whole spirit of psychoanalysis, always do what is best for himself. Who then does death belong to? If this has become a question during the current pandemic, it is because the lack of state provision, the missing medical supplies, the dearth of equipment, the isolation and at times visible terror of those cut off from all human touch, has made it feel to many for the first time that death is something of which a person, the one dying and the one closest to her or him, can be robbed. Freud and his wife could not reach their sick daughter because there was no transport, not even the trains getting children out of a defeated country starving in the aftermath of war. They could not be with her when she died. This, I think, might help us to understand these remarkable and famous lines from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which appear on the first pages of what we now know to be its new chapter 6. Quote, "If we are to die ourselves, and first to lose in death, it is easier to submit to a remorseless law of nature, to the sublime Erweigsinn, necessity, than to a chance which might perhaps have been escaped." In the preceding chapter, Freud had been elaborating his concept of the repetition compulsion, the compulsion first identified in soldiers returning from battle who found themselves reliving their worst experiences in their nighttime and waking dreams. Slowly tracing this tendency from the front to the consulting room, patients wedded to their symptoms, Freud concludes that such a compulsion is a property of all living matter. The prime urge of all organic life is to restore an earlier state of things. What follows is a considerable downgrade in the status of the drives of self-preservation and mastery, which were key to his early topography of the mind, as they are all now seen to be working in the service of the organism's need to follow the path to its own death. Quote, "The organism wishes to die only in its own fashion. The aim of all life," Freud states in perhaps one of his most shocking, counterintuitive affirmations, "is death." This theoretical trajectory, by Freud's own account, one of his most speculative, will be familiar to many of you. Freud is moving between elegy and treatise, between sorrow and science. We are strengthened in our belief, he comments, by the writings of our poets. But what stood out for me this time in those lines was a dimension which seems to end his thought with the death of Sophie, to which we can now confidently say this whole chapter came in response. Better death as a silent companion than a death that falls out of the skies. A remorseless law of nature is preferable to a death that might not have taken place. Nothing could be more resonant today as one person after another is confronted with the intolerable idea that their loved ones died through the reckless inefficiency of political buffoons whose incompetence, in the words of one Guardian newspaper columnist, quote, "is often indistinguishable from deliberate destructiveness." We know that all of Freud's writing coils out of his inner world, but I can think of no other moment where he lays his psychological cards on the table with such transparency. Nothing worse than the idea of death as one long string or chapter of accidents. Through the merciless randomness of their deaths, the victims of pandemic and war who have been indiscriminately mowed down with no rhyme or reason are being deprived of the essence of life. This is what Freud, in this overwhelming moment, is trying to give back to his daughter. He is restoring her rightful inheritance. To put it at its most simple, without the belief that life moves or should move along its path to its own end, her sudden rapid death, 5 days after falling ill, would have been too much for him to bear. Quote, "Easier to submit to a remorseless law of nature than to a chance that might perhaps have been escaped. It may be, he adds, citing Schiller, that this belief in the internal necessity of dying is only another of those illusions which we have created to bear the burden of existence. He was warding off her destiny, naming it for the outrage it was and still is for all those who today find themselves faced with the prospect or chance of a similar fate. For despite the glaring differences of class and race in how, where, and who the pandemic strikes, this prospect has to include just about everyone. Freud is offering a philosophy of grief. He is helping us understand why what is happening amongst us today can feel as much of an internal as an external catastrophe. Death in a pandemic is no way to die. Now, Freud's dismissal in his exchange with Wittels of his own ruminations on the immortality of the germplasm should give us pause. As if immortality were not something that you're likely to find yourself thinking about after the death of a child. This, I think, can explain partially why, in a letter to Ferenczi written 2 weeks after she died, grief-stricken as he was, he described her loss as a narcissistic injury, to be uncovered deep beneath the daily duties through which he was finding his way back to life, or a grave blow to one's narcissism, as he had written to Pfister 2 days after she died. Okay, a closer look at chapter 6 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which sees Freud on the trail of biological death, can perhaps guide us here. His question is whether biology will confirm his conviction that death is an inherent property of all organic life, or whether there is something in living substance that is immortal. According to earlier geneticist A. Weismann, death belongs solely to multicellular organisms whose soma dies at the moment of reproduction when the germplasm enters into the new living form. Unicellular organisms, on the other hand, do not appear to die, but eternally reproduce themselves, unless, you argue, as did Hartmann in his 1906 study, Death and Reproduction, unless that death cannot be reduced to the appearance of a dead body, but instead describes the moment when a cell comes to the end of its individual development as it mutates and gives itself over to the next stage of life. Now, just to relieve you, in case you didn't follow all of that, what matters here is not finally whether biology can give backing or not to Freud's troubled concept of a human drive to death. As is so often the case in his work, the issue is what these preoccupations generate, what they allow him to go on thinking about. In this sense, Freud writes with more than a hint of satisfaction, in this sense, protozoa are also mortal. In their case, death always coincides with reproduction, but it is to some extent obscured by it, since the whole substance of the parent animal, the whole substance may be transmitted directly into the young offspring. So the only thing that saves the organism from dying is the passage of its entire substance into its offspring. Perish the thought, we might say. Transpose this into human life, and the death of a biological child becomes a narcissistic injury, because it is only through the existence of children that the parent has a stab at eternity. What Freud is saying here is as chilling as it is simple. The only thing that keeps the parent alive is their child. Freud's death drive, therefore, descends into the most intimate substrate of living beings, seeming to lose itself in the minutiae of organic life. But at the same time, it reaches into the external political world. Contrary to what is so often suggested, the two realms of Freud's thinking are not antagonistic, but work in tandem with each other. Remember that the war was the essential backdrop to the concept of the repetition compulsion, as returning soldiers were reliving the dangers inflicted by the outside world. The very concept, by the way, of trauma, which according to an influential misreading, Freud is meant to have definitively abandoned from the 1890s onwards, is not true. It tracks all the way through his writings, especially in the middle of war. In fact, Freud's preoccupation with organic life and with the perils of the world, with inmost biological process and external hardship, become increasingly tied up in his thought. Just as the question of what we inherit without knowing it, our predisposition, and what the world rains down on us, the accidents of life, began to come together on the same page. Again, I have no doubt that it is COVID-19 that has newly alerted me to these strange alliances, not least as I struggle, like so many, to bring into some kind of psychic alignment the pain and moods of my inner life and the tragedy unfolding outside my door and everywhere. How to link these domains becomes a preoccupation of this second phase of Freud's working life, what war does to theory, we might say. After all, by his own account, a traumatized soldier is torn between the two, between the demands of loyalty to his own ego, which tells him to avoid danger at any cost, and loyalty to his nation, which requires that he be prepared to die. Are war and pandemic the worst thing that can happen or have ever happened to mankind? If at first sight that might seem like an insane question, although not as insane as we will see as Freud's reply, it nonetheless has the clearest resonance for the task he has set himself of trying to track the impact of the world on its subjects and of bygone ages on present time. We have seen how a preoccupation with immortality, duration, transmission runs like a thread through chapter 6 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, as Freud tried to navigate his daughter's death and face up to the fact that a link in the chain of being had broken beyond repair. But in another work written in the middle of the war, Freud follows the same path of the prehistory of humankind. Only this time he traces this prehistory not through the life of the germplasm, but to a far-off epoch when existence could fairly be described as hell on earth. War and pandemic shrink by its side. I'm referring to Freud's 12th metapsychological paper, which he finally did not wish to see the light of day, and which again none of us would have been able to access without the scholarly devotion of Ximitis, who published it in 1987 under the title A Phylogenetic Fantasy, as many of you will know. It was one of 7 supplementary metapsychological papers, all of which Freud discarded or even destroyed. So retrieving it against his wishes, she was playing Max Brod to his Kafka. In fact, Ximitis gave a remarkable lecture on this paper at a Freud Memorial Lecture in New York in 1987. She calls it a document of failure. It is truly wild. Wait till you hear. But she also accords it the deepest respect, arguing that it is the text in which Freud's theories of the drive and trauma, again most often seen as incompatible, reveal their deepest affiliation. The phylogenetic fantasy, or overview of the transference neuroses, makes the speculations of Beyond the Pleasure Principle look like hard science. In the beginning, Freud narrates an ice age turned man into an anxious animal when, quote, the hitherto predominantly friendly outside world transformed itself into a mass of threatening perils, end quote. End quote again. Food was not sufficient to permit an increase in the human hordes, and the power of the individual were not enough to keep so many helpless beings alive. Faced with an emergency beyond his control, man imposed on himself a ban on reproduction, since to propagate the species in a time of such want was to put his very existence on the line. No children, no future, no glimpse of an eternal life. Man's response to such a brute curtailing of his drives was hysteria, the origins of conversion hysteria in modern times, in which the libido is felt as a danger to be subdued. He also became a tyrant, bestowing on himself unrestrained dominance as a reward for his power to safeguard the lives of the many. Quote, language was magic to him. His thoughts seemed omnipotent to him. He understood the world according to his own ego. I love this. Tyranny is the silent companion of catastrophe, as has been so flagrantly demonstrated in the behavior of the US president and the rulers of several other nations across the world today. As if to say, I will save you, but you must make me king. Not that such rulers save anyone. Not to mention the accompanying idea that the tyrant was the first hysteric. The idea of bodily panic as the unspoken text of masculine power is surely as unexpected as it is one of Freud's most progressive. Note how political he is being in a text too easily dismissed as sheer fantasy, including by Freud himself. Rather, I suggest we see this paper as a thought experiment which allows him to take huge and unprecedented mental strides. What then passes through the generations deep within the psyche of the people is anxiety in response to an imperiled world, but also as a reaction to the tyranny of the powers that come to meet it. This is what children usher down through the generations. Quote, "The children bring along the anxiousness of the beginning of the Ice Age." End of quote. The child is repeating the history of the species, offering Freud key support in his belief in phylogenetic transmission, the preponderance of phylogenetic disposition over all other factors. And that's an emphasis he insists which does not eliminate the question of acquisition. It simply, he says, moves it into still earlier prehistory. Now, what this strange, unpublished until 1987, Ice Age meditation allows us to infer, as I read it, is that the concept of phylogenesis is, among other things, Freud's way of acknowledging the parlous state of mankind, want, poverty, affliction, and trouble, the catastrophes of history, the dreadful burden of the past. Modern-day psychoanalysis talks of transgenerational haunting, the unconscious passage of historical trauma from one generation to the next. We bring our ancestors trailing behind us, which means that while we may die our own death, we also die on behalf of the others who were there before us. Once more, way ahead of his time, Freud has taken this reality, which is now clinically recognized, and injected into the bloodstream of humankind. The organism passes its entire substance into the next generation. Given a world of disasters, Freud's 1915 paper eloquently reminds us of the price. As Grubrick-Simitis put it in her 1987 lecture, Freud has written a guide for our times. Quote, "Should we want to imagine a new man-made ice age and think in psychoanalytic terms about the consequences of a nuclear winter?" That's Grubrick-Simitis. She was, of course, writing long before the climate catastrophe would give his document an additional, no less alarming resonance. We are not done with the death drive. As I'm sure many of you will have been thinking, the death drive in Freud's account does not only belong on the side of quiescence, the slow, steady return of the living organism to an inanimate state. If the death drive is one of the most, if not the most controversial of Freud's theories, it is not just because of the deathly pallor it casts over life's journey. It is also, perhaps even more so, because it turns violence into the internal property of everyone. This aspect of the drive, for which it is best known, proved to be an idea even more scandalous than Freud's earlier belief that the drive for pleasure was the chief motivator of human life. Not least because it put paid to the cherished illusion that the evils of the world are the responsibility of everyone other than oneself. In a 1929 letter to Albert Einstein, Freud wrote, "All our attention is directed to the outside, whence dangers threaten and satisfactions beckon. From the inside, we only want to be left in peace. So if someone tries to turn our attention inwards, in effect twisting our necks, then our whole organization resists, just as, for example, the esophagus and the urethra resist any attempt to reverse their normal direction of passage." This must surely be one of the most visceral statements on why the response to psychoanalysis was so hostile. "There is nothing for which man's capabilities are less suited," he had written somewhat more decorously to Binswanger in 1911, "than psychoanalysis." Once again, this idea, elaborated for the first time in the chapter of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, written after the death of Sophie, is deeply imbricated in war. We might conjecture that it would have made Freud's task too easy, his grief fraudulent, if he had not also considered how war shatters the innocence of the human mind. After all, to begin with, as he himself acknowledged, all his libido had been on the side of Austro-Hungary. What drives people crazy in wartime is their capacity, after a lifetime of prohibition and restraint, to take violence upon themselves. Not just because killing presents man with a clash, as Freud puts it, between the claims of humanity and the demands of a national war, but because it brings him up against the violence that is an inner portion of being human. "Consider," he wrote in his 1916 introductory lecture on the censorship of dreams, Consider the Great War, which is still laying Europe waste. Think of the vast amounts of brutality, cruelty, and lies which are able to spread over the civilized world. Do you really believe that a handful of ambitious and deluding men without conscience could have succeeded in unleashing all these evil spirits if their millions of followers did not share their guilt? He could be talking about Brexit in the UK and or the 2016 US election of Donald Trump. In fact, I think he could be referring to any number of democratically elected autocrats, from Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, India's Narendra Modi, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Hungary's Viktor Orban. And there are, of course, more. Quote, "We lay a stronger emphasis on what is evil in man," he continues, "only because other people disavow it, and thereby make the human mind not better, but incomprehensible." I started this lecture by suggesting the one thing which today's pandemic is depriving of us of is the ambivalence of human grief. Having taken the intellectual and emotional journey I've taken as I was writing, it has come to seem unsurprising to me that Freud should emerge in these pages as the thinker of disaster. In a world gone numb under the pressure of incompetence, lies, and false triumphalism, his ideas can help us restore, first, the bald truth of what is happening, and then, and only on that basis, all the shades of our inner world, of what lives and dies in the unconscious. In a relatively unknown section of Thoughts for the Time on War and Death, written in 1915, Freud describes the birth pangs of ethical life, arising when man, as yet unsullied by civilization, confronted the untrammeled mix of emotions, despair, rage, hatred, and pleasure, which he experienced in the face of death, especially towards those he loved most. Out of this mix arises the first ethical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." It was acquired, he writes, in, quote, "in relation to dead people who were loved, as a reaction against the satisfaction hidden behind the grief for them. And it was gradually extended to strangers who were not loved, and finally, even to enemies." Although he also observes, with an eye to the unfolding war, that such an embrace of the whole world, enemies included, has been lost to so-called civilized man, together, quote, "with the vein of ethical sensitiveness which accompanied it." Now, when teaching Freud, I always use these lines to convey to students that at decisive moments, Freud was far less ethnocentric than is often assumed. Civilized man has lost the vein of ethical sensitivity belonging to the so-called uncivilized. But what makes these thoughts so relevant today is the implied message, one which is barely audible at a time when the psyche is being exiled to the outskirts of existence, the unshared secret of the hour. Only if you are in touch with the ambivalence of the heart, even towards those you most love, is there the faintest chance that you will reach out across the world to everyone, including your putative enemies. To China, for example, a country which the Western world is now being told to hate. To black men being mowed down on the streets. To the citizens of another country which in the race for a COVID-19 vaccine just might be ahead of the game. To all those who are also suffering, whether from war or pandemic, or like everyone else, from the simple fact of being human. But for this to happen, the present-day run of narcissistic, mainly male leaders would first have to acknowledge their failings, something of which they seem constitutionally incapable, which would also entail withdrawing their casually dispersed and carefully targeted hatreds. The two seem to be inseparable. I, of course, belong to a race, Freud wrote to the writer Romain Rolland in 1923, which in the Middle Ages were held responsible for all epidemics. He would have been appalled at the blame game, which has been the daily accompaniment of COVID-19. Now, although Freud remarked that the impulse to human empathy is difficult to explain and that compassion can be a veil for narcissism, there are moments in his writing, again in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the work of his which truly embraces the nether depths, when the bare outlines of such an impulse can be found. Like the protective shield of the psyche which allows itself to die to save all the deeper layers of the mind from a similar fate, or the community of cells which survive even if individual cells have to die. Something is working through Freud's text, a socius primitive in Derrida's reading, or a new form of common life never more needed than now, which sheds the common pitfalls of the singular ego, in which the pain of the times is shared, and which every human subject, regardless of race, class, caste, or sex, would be able to participate. This might be what it means to struggle for a world in which everyone is free to die their own death. Let me end very briefly with two writers who I had not encountered before I began thinking about this lecture, both of whose lives brushed against Freud's at the end, and who in their very different ways bring these issues into the starkest relief. The first is the Austrian writer Rachel Burdach, who got in touch with Freud in 1938, shortly after he arrived in London. He arrived in Elsworthy Road, but was soon here, to die in freedom. They had both escaped from the Nazis. His 5 sisters who remained were deported to Theresienstadt, one dying in the ghetto, the other 4 in the Treblinka concentration camp. Burdach had sent him her novel, The Emperor, the Sages, and Death, this mysterious and beautiful book, he wrote to her, which pleased me so much it made me unsure of my judgment. Who are you, he asks. Where did you acquire all the knowledge expressed in your book? He invites her to meet him and assumes, given the priority our novel grants to death, that she must be very young. Freud was right and wrong. In 1938, she was in fact 60 years old and Freud was 82. But according to Theodor Reich, who had been her analyst, she had composed her novel in her head as a young woman, reciting it to herself word by word over decades, unwilling to commit it to print due to a fear that had set in following the death of someone she had loved. And it was only after the far greater losses she experienced at the hands of the Nazis that the shadow over her life dissipated, and she had finally been able to commit her novel to writing. Now, I'm not going to try and do this book justice. It merits a whole lecture in itself. I couldn't believe it when I came across it. It's orchestrated as a set of philosophical dialogues between Frederick, the German 12th century emperor and enlightened despot, the Egyptian Arab physician Abu Sina, and the Rabbi Sharif ben Aaron, and there are also several Catholic anti-Semites thrown in for good measure. And so across the borders of race and class, this novel orchestrates a genuine multicultural meeting of minds and beliefs. And the psychoanalytic resonances are everywhere, from the emperor's expressed wish to understand man's propensity for the dark, which was the epigraph I read you at the beginning, to the rabbi's description of Jewish understanding as aimed not just at what is being kept secret, but at what is unknown. And as Freud observes, this is a novel about dying. I wish to be conscious to the very end, the emperor asserts, so as not to lose life's most mysterious part, which reminds me of Winnicott's famous statement, please God, let me be alive at my own death. But as we've all witnessed so painfully over this past while, to die one's own death is not the same thing as dying alone in a world that feels deserted. In the very last pages, the rabbi wakes up one morning alone in a still, grey, quiet world from which everyone appears to have fled. Slowly realizing that something awful has happened, he becomes overwhelmed by a single desire to catch up with those he is sure are about to be confronted by unexpected terror and meet a dreadful fate. Must he not share their fate before he dies? He is too late. Men, beasts, and plants are all gone. Death has swallowed the earth. Not a million miles from Grub-Ximeter's nuclear winter or from the catastrophe of climate change, this could be a chronicle of death foretold for the era we are living now. He dies in isolation, but it is to a solidarity of people in the midst of disaster, must he not share their fate, that he commits his last breath. Finally, in 1937, a year before the encounter between Burdach and Freud, the German psychoanalyst and neurologist, John Rittmeister, returned from Switzerland to Hitler's Germany to complete his training analysis, at considerable risk, as he was already known to the authorities for his communist sympathies. Appointed director of the Goering Institute, the skeleton psychoanalytic institute purged of Jews that were permitted to function under Hitler, he managed to work for the underground resistance until he was arrested by the Gestapo for treason in 1942 and executed in Plötzensee prison in 1943. Two remarkable entries from his prison diaries will bring today's thoughts to a close. In the first, dated 24th of December 1942, Rittmeister refers to his abominable fate and then immediately chastises himself. I say my abominable fate, forgetting too quickly the millions of abominable fates being played out across Europe and everywhere, without an end to blood, suffering, and tears, and fear. Like someone who loses all taste because their neighbor's plate is empty, this suffering prevents me from enjoying the pleasures of life. In the second entry, dated 12th of January 1943, he is musing on two different ways of ethical being in the world. One is dominated by the subject's own egocentricity and subjectivity. Absorbing the other into their own mental sphere, they turn the other into no more than an occasion for enlarging their own ego. The second path, by contrast, grants true autonomy to the other, who is therefore free to subsist in their own way. This way of being, expansive, open, and loving, belongs, he writes, to the core of the work of Sigmund Freud, which, he says, teaches us love, not introversion. Against the odds, Rittmeister was, we might say, dying his own death. But how, we might also wonder, could a man on the brink of execution by the Nazis find room to reach out to the millions of others doomed to an abominable fate, and also be able to articulate such a generous, self-effacing vision? Today, in the midst of a pandemic seemingly without end, there are calls for new forms of solidarity in life and in death, and for a new inclusive political consciousness spurred by the ever more glaring social injustices and inequalities of our time. Which leaves me with a question. How to find a place in this new reality for the darker aspects of being human, which, like upside-down sunflowers, remain at the center of the unfinished project of psychoanalysis. Failing which, with the best will in the world, any move we might make in that direction will, I fear, prove in the long run to be an empty gesture. To make sure this does not happen, we could perhaps do worse, as I have tried to do here, than return to Freud's radical, all-encompassing, and finally loving vision. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
So, hold on, I'm just having to get something. Jacqueline, I don't know if you can see me. This is a truly unbelievable space for the one that you're standing in. As you said, it was truly amazing and completely surprising to see you standing and reading this, I find absolutely phenomenal paper, that you stand there between two couches. One that we're very familiar with, that had to leave Vienna under very brutal circumstances. And then the other very, small but very prosaic couch. And to know that that was the couch, as Carol said, on which Freud took his last breath. That is and truly moving. The other thought I had is that the space in which we are, I don't know if you can see me, I don't know if you could see that I could see you, made me think very much of Winnicott's transitional space. We're sort of in between spaces, hearing one another, not knowing exactly whether we can see one another. And so this pandemic, with all its horrible effects and circumstances, and as you say, producing
a death that we are no longer free to die, has nonetheless also created for us, I think, today, and for you, a space of really coming together in ways we've never been able to come together. The London Museum, the Viennese Museum, and you can speak to us in those ways. I want to paraphrase Rachel Clark, whom you mentioned in your paper, who says that she wants to keep things small as statistics threaten to overthrow her. And I feel like I'm so impressed by your paper and all the levels you're touching upon. You are able to provide, I feel, an incredibly intimate and touching picture of Freud, of his incredibly deep sorrow. You're able to bring together and give a new reading to a paper that hasn't been discussed very infrequently, but really with a new slant beyond the pleasure principle. And you bring in, and I think in a fantastic way, his little-known paper on a phylogenetic fantasy, together with his theories on mourning and melancholia. So I want to thank you, and I want to open up the discussion to all of the people who have listened to us, because the discussion to your paper will be written by Ruben Gallo, who couldn't join us today. So my job here is simply to moderate your fantastic paper and to really thank you profoundly for the thoughts that you were able to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have, I don't know if there are any questions yet, but we did have a question that was sent to me from Julia Kristeva, and I'm wondering whether Dr. Kristeva, you would like to pose this question yourself, or whether you would prefer, I have it both in French and English before me, whether you would want to pose your question yourself. No.
No, I prefer you read it.
Ah, you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, fantastic.
It would be better that you read it. Thank you.
Okay, but that's wonderful. It's another one, another transitional space here. Okay.
It is the power of speech over death.
Yes. Yeah.
And how analytic discourse can be through new media and not only in the presence of the living bodies.
But
So,
okay, I read your question, but you feel free to add something to it too, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So Dr. Kristeva writes the following: thank you for this intense conference that richly resonates not only with the pandemic shaking up the planet, but first and foremost with the analytical experience and of course with the memory of Freud on the 91st anniversary of his death. I'd like to raise 2 points that call out for psychoanalysis' capacity to reinvent itself at the crossroads of virality and the anthropological acceleration underway. Firstly, femicide, which analytical research approaches by proposing a feminine ethics, garnered from Freud's last text and current clinical research. I spoke of this at the London IPA conference in July 2019. The second point is in a similar vein. When you say, I'm quoting the task of psychoanalysis to accept the fullest psychic responsibility for oneself, your argument brings me to what I call the central phobia of the neotenic beings that we are, that is to say, unfinished, dependent, and mortal. The central phobia is angst around death, broken and accentuated by virality, meets the maternal feminine, which turns under the auspices of care in a kind of grip. The phobia then explodes into destructiveness in the psychic space itself among all involved in the viralized, hyperconnected, and virtualized confinement. This clinical observation leads us to discover the human disaster that the pandemic is causing, such that it cannot be resolved with political, economic, and health measures only, essential as they are. We urgently need to change the paradigm and put individual personhood at the center of our data, at the essential levels of the social pact, the ethical, educational, religious, political levels. That is where issues of old age, mortality, boundaries, and limits become the main topics for the day after. I therefore hold that psychoanalysis is different from other approaches to the human being in that it wagers on reconstituting the psychic space damaged by diverse, freedom-destroying maneuvers. Why this audacious undertaking? One that religion before us claimed to manage. Because a transferential relationship bequeathed to us by the inventor of the unconscious, and which solicits each of two protagonists, the analysand and the analyst, participates in this ongoing transvaluation of identity, otherness, and singularity between two and within oneself. Only from there it is possible to grasp the meaning of the limits. If we do not reevaluate the sense of in-betweenness and limits that are part of religious and moral history, if we do not rebuild human innerness, our planet, even if cleaned up through ecological rigor, risks being delivered over to the cruelty of its first inhabitants, namely the viruses. It is the inner self that we must therefore save given the current state of viral war.
Would you like me to respond?
That would be lovely, Jacqueline.
Okay. Well, it's a statement as much as a question. Julia Kristeva, I'm so pleased you're here, and your work has had a huge influence on my thinking over the years. And you, of course, speak from the place of a practicing psychoanalyst, which I do not. And it sounds to me as if what you're talking about is what the psychoanalytic space is capable of preserving under the present conditions. And I was very struck by something I read by Dana Bixby recently, where she was talking about how the break of the frame in the analytic session, so that you're having a completely different form of contact if you're doing it virtually. The break of the frame is equivalent to a psychotic trauma, psychotic-inducing trauma. So that analysis, on the one hand, creates what you're describing here, which is a transitional space in which otherness and singularity can be negotiated, which we need in the outside world, so that all the others don't become simply the strangers to us, about which you have written many, many times. But nonetheless, there's a danger in those alternative analytic spaces. They're not just safe, and nor could they be, and nor are they meant to be. So I would really want to put back to you the question of how you deal with the kind of dangers and the kind of intensity. You've written about this. You did a wonderful webinar on this, the viral situation and psychoanalysis, where you talked about the explosion, as you do here, a kind of psychotic core of defensiveness that crumbles and explodes, and how we deal with that, not just inside the psychoanalytic setting, but outside. Let me just say one more thing, which is the piece you were referring to is another short piece that I've written, which is indeed about feminicide, and it's about the dreadful effect of lockdown on women who are living in abusive relationships. And one of the most chilling things to witness at the moment has been the fact that when the government said stay home, save lives, across the world, in fact, nobody thought what this would mean for women in an abusive relationship. And on a BBC Panorama program, a woman was asked, what did stay home, save lives mean to you? She said death, right? So it has been exponential, the increase in violence against women. And I think you've commented on this, that it's the vulnerability exposed by the pandemic, which women are meant to hold at bay. They're meant to save men from it. This is what Hannah Arendt wrote about. They're meant to save men from the precariousness of life. So they're getting punished because of the deaths. So how do you negotiate the space between what is sayable inside analysis, its not exact pleasures, but its capacity and its dangers, and the dangers in the outside world? That would be my question back to you. It would be part of a long conversation.
Will you answer, Dr. Kristeva?
We'll have to leave the floor for other questions. We can continue our conversation and debates in other circumstances. But my thinking is that it's important to take the possibility that is given to us through new media in order to maintain the human being between the traumatic situation that a lot of us experience in the pandemic situation and the transferential link. And this is an exceptional situation, of course. The presentation of core the psychoanalytic setting is something that you have to maintain. But I had the impression also that in the exceptional situation through virtual media, some traumatic situations can be transmitted to the analyst, and even in a more intense way, being behind situation of shame or narcissistic presentation, so that the media, the virtual media, becomes not an obstacle, but a sort of membrane between the deepest sides of the unconscious of the patient and the analyst. So we have to continue to analyze these limits and bad effects, but also favorable and opening situations that we are in situation to cross in the modern world. This is an important question to resolve, because psychoanalysis is one of the most important, I think, means of human sciences that gives us the arms to cross the death wish and this disaster that is pandemic, but also the ecocide and feminicide. But let's stop here our exchange and please give the floor to others. Thank you very much. And I'm also, as Jan, very impressed by the deepest and the very intense presentation of Jacqueline. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Other questions? Because I see that we have a lot of listeners from Russia, but we don't have a Russian translator here, so I'm wondering if there are questions from Russia, whether, Victor, you might be able to...
So we have also many participants from Ukraine.
Aha, okay, please.
Now, at first, I would like to share many thanks for the nice presentation in the name of maybe Ukrainian colleagues, but I think we have some colleagues speaking much more better than me English, maybe. But it was. I have only one question. Maybe it is not maybe not maybe concrete connected with the presentation, but it is very interesting that in 1890-20 there was the big pandemia of influenza. We know that, and this pandemia today they so-called to repeat this pandemic disaster in 20th century, and the Freud survived in this pandemic in this pandemic of influenza, and I don't know if he mentioned about this pandemia in his works. I don't know. Maybe you know something about that.
I think Jacqueline does.
Well, I can respond to that, but Jean, so can you, because you've written about it. The point is, he barely responded to it in his writing. I think that's right, Jean. I mean, there's an incredible silence that passes over the Spanish flu, and he hardly talks about it. And you have to dig deep into the biographies to discover how ill his wife was and how all his other 3 children fell ill. So he barely talks about it. He talks about the death of his daughter, which was, of course, the result of the Spanish flu. But and then there's that wonderful quote where he says, "I belong to a race who've always been accused of being responsible for all epidemics." So it erupts in moments in his writing, but addressing it directly on, well, in the phylogenetic fantasy, this is a world of, well, it's a world of catastrophe. It's not a world of pandemic that he's describing, but I think it's related. I think they're connected. But Jean, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, I mean, you know the piece that I wrote for the Freud Museum, and it was, as you said, you know, I became very curious how Freud would deal with the pandemic. So I was trying to read everything under the sun from, you know, around the period from 1918 to 1920. Because all we ever knew was that that Sophie died, and as you mentioned in your text, Martha was very ill beforehand, and 3 of his other children were very ill, and at the same time he had to worry, as you also mentioned in your paper, of his 2 sons, who he did not know for quite a while where they were during the war. So it took him some time to find out that Martin was imprisoned in I think in Genoa in Italy, and I think it just seeps through in his writings. And the only times he manifestly talks about it is in his correspondence with Abraham Pfister and Ferenczi. But what I love about your paper is the very intimate connection you draw about the fact that he was not able to go and see Sophie, whom he had just seen before, when they were told, he and Martha, that she was sick. So because he thought, as you were saying, that she had the same illness as Martha, and so initially they weren't that worried, but then she died within 3 days, and the pain of not being able to go and see her because there was no way to come to travel to Hamburg, and you're linking it to all these, as you say so rightly, these reckless and random deaths, where family members can no longer go and see their mothers and grandmothers and fathers because they have to die alone in these old age homes or hospitals, I think is absolutely brilliant. And also, I think the way he's trying to make sense of this random, as you say, from the sky falling death through his writings later on in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it is really, I think, is very much on the point. So I really wanted to thank you for that insight.
Thank you. Can I just say that I know there are quite a few people who registered with Nora for the Zoom connection, so they will be able to ask questions. So I'm wondering if any of them
Michael
are
Parsons
visible.
there.
Okay. So shall we hear from Michael Parsons?
Yes, I see you. Would you like to say something? This is too loud.
I'm not sure he can hear us. Michael, can you hear us?
Yes, here I am.
There you are.
I was just having a bit of trouble unmuting myself, I'm afraid. Jacqueline, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Lots of new stuff that I'm looking forward to following up. The thought that it brought up in my mind is, what about the life drive? Because you've been talking so powerfully about death, thanatos, the death drive. How would you not in the present circumstances? In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the other half of the drive that Freud talks about is eros, the life drive. And one might think, and one might hope certainly, that the attack on humanity, that the COVID pandemic, not to mention all the other things going on in the world at the moment that you alluded to, but the manifestation of the power of, let's call it the death drive for shorthand, would provoke into action the life drive, eros, in a countervailing attempt to push things in the other direction. Do you see any sign of that, or do you have any thoughts to do with that?
Well, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right, that was not the topic. But of course, Freud, the life and death drives was one of Freud's great binaries that in the end don't completely work as a binary. Because there are several points where he says the admixture of destructiveness, there are points where he says eros is a counter to the death drive and civilization, the survival. Our survival depends on eros, the drive to unification, defeating the drive to disintegration of death. He says that several times. But then again in his papers on war, he says at least once that the admixture of aggressiveness with eros hugely fuels its efficiency and its pleasure. We should say he cannot keep them apart completely. He can't, the binary doesn't completely work. Now, I think what you're saying about do I see signs of a kind of an affirmative drive to life? Well, yes, everywhere, in the carers, in the hospitals, in the people marching for Black Lives Matters and so on. I think there's an absolute upsurge of a sense of radical possibility of transformation of the social tie, and the idea that things cannot continue and the world must be quite simply repaired. The problem is that, as was absolutely graphic on a news program, Channel 4 News last night here, I'm sure some people would have seen it, there is, that people are arming themselves for the 2016 election, the 2020 re-election. People are arming themselves, and the resurgence of QAnon and right-wing hate groups, which are giving themselves a new license to speak in the present pandemic, and the anti-vaxxers and the people who are flooding onto Trafalgar Square to say that they do not want their freedom destroyed and so on. I mean, it's a battle, right? I don't want to say it's a battle between good and evil or between life and death drives, but I think I'd be closer to what Julia Kristeva just said. It's a battle as to how far people are able to negotiate their inner lives or not. And Christopher Bolas gave a seminar recently, which I'm sure you attended, the webinar, Civilization of the Discontented, where he talked very much about the destruction of thinking, which is part of a kind of psychotic push to repudiate both what's happening, death, and the life of the mind. So I think they're related in that way. So there's a struggle afoot, to say the least. I couldn't agree with you more. It would also relate to Judith Butler's work on the precariousness of life and the acceptance and repudiation of that, and the connection, the possibility of connectedness or not, or the possibilities of nonviolence. I'm waiting to see if she might be here. I know she registered and might have something to contribute on this, but it would be good to hear from anybody. But thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thank you very much.
We do have a comment from Judith Butler. I don't know if she can hear us, if she can speak herself, or if she wants me to read what she has written. But your wish is fulfilled, Jacqueline. Here she speaks, or wrote. No. So, from Judith Butler to everyone. A beautiful and complex paper that brings up so many incredible pathways for thought. You mentioned that an ethical perspective emerges in which my fate and our fate cannot be firmly separated. The moment the pandemic becomes a limitation and sense of threat imposed on the self, it is also imposing limitation and threat for others. The death I grieve is not the same as the death that another grieves, and yet the fact of grieving connects us. What does it say about the relationship between the individual and the social, and the task of psychoanalysis to dwell in that place where the two zones cannot be fully differentiated?
Whoa. I hope I'm not expected to answer that question, right?
Get to it.
But I think you're saying, so, for me, it's up for grabs, right? Whether what's happening in the pandemic is a blurring of the boundaries between disparate forms of grief, i.e. a new form of grieving solidarity, which would speak so much to your earlier work on which lives are grievable or not. It's as if you could say the pandemic is driving a coach and horses between the separability of my grief and your grief. You could say that. But I'm sure, as I said in my reply to Michael Parsons, that's only half the story. What we might be witnessing is one of the clear, and this conversation is helping me think about this, that we might be witnessing one of the clearest struggles between forms of connection across psychic boundaries, what Levinas, of course, calls the face-to-face, but in which you've written about many times, but forms of connection across psychic boundaries which somehow manage not to deny, not to thwart, but work with the defenses that can then get you to the other person, and a re-entrenchment of those differences. And I think in the shot that I cannot get out of my mind and I find most disturbing is the white vigilantes pointing their rifle at the Black Lives Matter protesters a couple of months ago. But you need to put that alongside Hutchinson, the black protester, lifting from the middle of the crowd a vulnerable white body and carrying him to safety. So we've had the most extraordinary exemplar of things which were sort of unthinkable a few months ago, as if the social fault lines of the culture and the risks at the level of human subjectivity are not just in the consulting room where they clearly are in the way that Julia Kristeva described, but they're literally on the streets. So that would be my response to your question, but I'd like you to answer it.
We don't have yet an answer to that. So
Yes. I don't know.
That was a rhetorical
Yeah.
point I just made.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Okay. Sorry. Jacqueline, I think that's right. I don't think the distinction between individual and social can be blurred, and in fact, it seems that sometimes it's intensified. But you started your lecture by reminding us of ambivalence, and psychic ambivalence in particular, which seems to afflict the social bond. And you also, at one point, cautioned that the movement for social solidarity will have to deal with the darker side of the human psyche. And it just seems to me that that you are suggesting a way to move between individual psychoanalytic treatment theory and a broader social and political critique in your practice, but also in the understanding of psychic life as a kind of crossroads, a conflicted, ambivalent crossroads between the individual and the social. So not a blurring or a merging, but some kind of ongoing tension.
Okay, I'd just like to respond to your point about ambivalence, because one of the most important quotes for me in the paper I just read is when Freud says the reason, when he describes all the millions of people who followed these terrible political leaders in times of war. He says, if we lay emphasis on the evil in the human heart, it is because so many people disavow it, which does not make man better. It simply makes him incomprehensible. And I suppose that would be, that quote for me is so poignant, because he's saying we have to, we can't do what Clinton did at the last election and describe the people who are going to vote for Trump as deplorables. We really can't do that. We've got to have a much more complex way of reckoning with the political positions that we feel endanger us. But it's dangerous territory to tread. That's why they're so powerful. That's why they might win again in November, although we're all praying, of course not. Thank you.
Further questions?
I don't so much have a question as just a thank you to Dr. Rose. It's a difficult subject, but somehow listening to you, I feel hope.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I don't know who you are. I can't see from here.
Oh, it's Lexa from New York and the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies.
Oh, hello, Lexa. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I can ask a question. I was very impressed by your. Sorry, I'm Herman Westerink. I'm not. I'm at the Freud Museum actually, as you can see. I have. I was thinking about what you said about the strange comments of Freud on his on the death of his daughter Sophie. That he thought of it in terms of a narcissistic blow. And then I was thinking, what struck me was the fact that in your paper you didn't refer to some of the passages in Thoughts on the Times of War and Death, where he seems to say, well, we as an individual, as an ego, cannot imagine or think our own death or mortality. We can only do so by seeing the death and feeling, be touched by the death of another person, a loved person. And I was thinking maybe that is a very crucial passage in Freud's work, also to think through how we reflect on death, how we see our own mortality and death, but also in times of the pandemic, a kind of a paradox that we know that a lot of people die in numbers, but a lot of people die in solitude, so we don't really see that or recognize that. Can maybe not even fully imagine their death and mortality as such, people dying in their solitude. That maybe that is one of the, let's say, paradoxical experiences of this COVID pandemic, and also maybe helps us to understand why some people deny the pandemic or just, throw it from the table, as if the dying and the deaths and mortality does not exist. That's a very layered question, maybe, but I'd like to hear your response to that.
Oh, thank you so much. I had to cut out a small moment where I talked about Walter Benjamin saying that in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, death had been exiled to the boundaries of existence. And there used to be two things he said. First of all, up to the 19th century, writers claimed their authority from the fact of death. And secondly, there used to be no house in which there wasn't a room in which somebody had died. But we have banished death as unthinkable to the outskirts of existence. And this had a chilling resonance in 9/11, when, as I'm sure you know, the pictures of people falling from the Twin Towers were taken off the news channels within 12 hours, partly out of discretion for the victims, but also because nobody must be seen to die. You're either dead or you're alive, but the actual process of dying is inconceivable and is unthinkable. So I agree with you about that. But on the other hand, a paper that I discussed at a conference on the death drive in Paris with Judith Butler a few years ago is a very short unpublished piece by Melanie Klein called What Does Death Mean to the Individual? And I won't try and do a riff on it here, but it is quite remarkable for two reasons. One, because it's prefaced by Joan Riviere saying, it's 1940. I should have said that in this, to say it's 1940. It's prefaced by Joan Riviere saying, of course, the task of analysis is to create a space in which to endure what is most difficult. She said, but why should we endure everything? There are some things that are insupportable, which we should not be able to endure, which is a very striking phrase. And the other thing is that Klein's own ruminations at that time is to reduce the persecution of the inner life so that you can hate better in the outside world. It's very unlike what you would expect from her. We're in the middle of a war, right? So you have to reduce, death becomes something that you should be able to think, both in relationship to your inner world and in relationship to the need to recognize who is the enemy. And of course, the Second World War was the one where people felt that was relatively clear compared, say, with the First World War. So yes, I mean, you know, Freud is brilliant. I'm remembering the wonderful moment where he says, death is unthinkable, as is summed up in the joke, when one of us dies, I will move to Paris, you know, which is that people just cannot imagine it or get their mind around it. I would disagree with you on one thing, though. I think death, unlike what Walter Benjamin was describing, I think this pandemic has brought death into people's homes. Depends on what you watch. But there are programs going out every night or regularly, which are about what is actually happening in the care home and how people are taking the government to court, right? There's a bereaved group that is taking the government to court because of the neglect of the dead and because of the people who died who shouldn't have. So death is kind of present in a way that it wasn't before, as well as being pushed aside because it's too painful to think about. So I think we're again in a new situation. And thank you for your question. I need to think about it some more. Thank you.
And I just add here that thank you for saying that, because I know it sounded weird. It's Lexa again, that I said, you give me hope. This is exactly why, because what you're talking about is that we are looking and acknowledging and dealing with this and not just, pulling it off the news in 12 hours. And somehow
I didn't hear the last bit, Lexa. We're not, what, in 12 hours?
Pulling it off the news in 12 hours, like the example you gave of the, so that it's somehow, if you can reckon with something, then you can feel some kind of positive energy around it if we are allowed to look at it and reckon with it.
That's the psychoanalytic wager, right? I think that's what Michael Parsons was also talking about, and Kristeva. So we're all sort of on a similar page about this, not exactly the same page, but sort of a space in which you want to go on thinking. And I would just say to you that there have been moments when I've been writing this lecture where I thought, this is the last thing I should be doing. It's too difficult, it's too painful. And then there are other moments where I thought, this is exactly what I should be doing to deal with the difficulty and pain that is all around. Did I solve it one way or the other? No, I wouldn't expect to.
Jacqueline, you draw a very powerful picture, and of the randomness and the recklessness of the death that we hear about and watch every day. I think in a way, maybe I misunderstood you there, but I think you allude without saying, of course, to also the millions of deaths, and we're approaching a bit of that number, that were intentionally killed when we think of the Holocaust. And I think what's so shuddering about this pandemic is that there is pure recklessness, carelessness. There's no ideology behind that is killing so many million people all over the world at the same time. So I was wondering about that comparison. And the last thing I wanted to say, I think the numbers also that we don't often think about and talk about is all the millions of family members who have survived the dead, but have not been able to say goodbye to them or be present at their death. So there was, I think, a recent article in the Guardian where I can't remember the number, but there were about 8 million people left bereft and traumatized by the sudden death of so many people dying in the pandemic.
Okay, I think we agree partly and disagree slightly, because I did use the word reckless, but I also quoted that Guardian article which said it almost feels like deliberate destructiveness. I mean, there is a kind of toxic masculinity represented by Bolsonaro, Trump, and Boris Johnson, which would literally disintegrate if it had to acknowledge its own frailty. And therefore, the project of denying the awfulness of the virus has been a question of psychic survival, and therefore, which is fatal. I mean, 20,000 people's lives would have been saved if Boris Johnson had introduced the lockdown 1 week earlier. That's more or less accepted now. So although it's true that it's random and reckless, I also feel there is a psychic agenda which is being driven through by some of these autocratic leaders, a bit like what Freud says in the phylogenetic fantasy. So the other thing is that, as Jean, you say in your paper, war is seen as human-induced, whereas this is seen as a virus that comes out of the skies. Well, of course, that isn't true, because the more we read, the more we know that it is the destruction of the habitat and the breakage of the links between humans and animals and plants that is allowing the virus to leap from animals to humans, so that according to one recent report, we can expect 6 viruses a year in the future if that link in the chain is not repaired. But you are, of course, saying something very important about the Holocaust, where it is systematic. It is death according to instrumental reason. And that is industrial genocide is a whole other thing. And I don't think it has a place in this conversation. It would need a much, much bigger discussion. I don't want to just say something hasty and trivial about that. But thank you for that. Thank you.
I think we have to wind down, but if there are any questions left from any of the listeners, please take this opportunity to pose it now.
Jacqueline, it's me, Pumla, from Cape Town.
Oh, wow.
Thank you so much for such a always challenging, wonderfully complex presentation that makes us think. I am thinking about death and the inability to mourn and the difficulty to mourn by people who have to witness their loved ones die without them on their side. People in South Africa, we are witnessing this almost every day, where burials are just conducted by funeral attendants, by 2-1 people, and in some cases where family members are rejected by their own loved ones who are afraid of contracting the disease. Now, how to think about what's going to happen in a country where there is the pandemic and there is the history of the violence of apartheid, and how that is infused and is entangled with the history of apartheid and the violence of apartheid in communities that are now facing the violence of the pandemic, with all that it means. You know, the women who are abused because they are now stuck in these homes with violent partners, the young people who were not born until after apartheid, who, because they've got to be locked down, under lockdown, they find themselves having to seek for accommodation. You know, under different conditions, they could get by because they're not locked down. They could be anywhere. But now, because they've got to escape, so in many cases, with little ones, we find, for instance, sprawling sites, land in South Africa, in Cape Town, where young people are building these shacks because they need a place to be locked down in, away from, to be safe, you know, in this very fragile sense of security, sense of safety. How we can think through this in the aftermath of the pandemic, where the entanglement of the past and the present and the violence of the past and the violence of the pandemic, and the difficulty to mourn all of this in a country like South Africa. I wonder what you would say to that.
Well, I don't, that is so evocative, Pumla, and I'm so honored that you're able to be here today because of the extraordinary work you're doing in South Africa. And what I want to say is that this must be the topic of your Stellenbosch Reparation and Trauma Center. The relationship between the violence of the persistent inequality of post-apartheid life and the violence of the pandemic, and the way I would anticipate they are greatly exacerbating each other and making it even harder to move forward, or not, and I'm not in a position to comment on that. But I would have thought that if there are spaces in the world where these things can be thought about, you have created one of them. And I hope you'll make this the subject of your next
And I hope you
venture.
come back. I hope you come back to engage with us in this. It's such a critical moment.
No, I do that. I'm very moved. Thank you, Pumla. Thank you so much for just laying that out, because I don't think many people are aware. We've had quite a lot of attention paid to India and what happens in slums, and why there is no way, you know, hand sanitizer, soap, washing your hands, social distancing in slums. It's a joke, right? You're adding another dimension in relationship to the immediate history, which will feel to some, I suspect, like a repetition in a new form. But it's so important to hear that from you. Thank you. Thank you deeply.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Anybody else? One last question. Well, maybe we have to put an end to this one tonight. Thank you so very much, Jacqueline. This was a truly wonderful moment, or more than a moment, in a really exceptional space. Maybe, as you say, it may not be the last time that we have to conduct the Freudian lecture in between spaces, in between couches. But I thank you very much, and I think you have provoked so many thoughts. I imagine that many people will write you because of how much they were moved by your words. Thank you very much. And thank you also, London Freud Museum, Carol, for providing this incredible space to us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.